Hello there! Welcome back to Deconstructing Directing. We are in the midst of Act 1, Defining Directing, where we introduced the flame paradigm in Scene 1, and now we're going to dive into Scene 2, Facilitation/Translation. Now, if this is your first encounter with Deconstructing Directing, you can learn more about it either in the video description if you're watching this directly on YouTube, or via the Library tab if you're watching this on our website. As a quick recap, in Act 1, Scene 1, we introduced you to the flame paradigm, a structure for defining the role of a director across 5 dimensions: facilitation/translation, leadership, artistic insight and taste, management, and education/mentorship. Along with this video, there are links to the PDF transcript and the podcast version of this content below, along with a few other worksheets and other resources that you might find helpful in your journey as a director. We'll start first by defining our terms, which, as it happens, is an excellent tool for facilitation. I don't know if you've noticed this, but in the theater world, we make a lot of assumptions. Maybe you've heard or said things like, "Doesn't he know that's not how you're supposed to do it?" Or, "No, I shouldn't have to tell her that. She should know." In educational theater spaces, there are perhaps fewer assumptions about knowledge, but there are still lots of assumptions that we make about values, what matters most to others, comfort levels, and definitions of what particular jobs entail. One of the worst offenders is the role of the assistant director. When was the last time you heard a crystal clear definition of what an assistant director's job is? Another common one I see is costume design. In some theaters, especially upstream theaters, the costume designer is also expected to handle wardrobe, helping with quick changes during the show itself, washing costumes, etc., while in others, that's a completely different person's job. Over the last 30 years, I have seen assumptions about who is responsible for what lead to hurt feelings, broken relationships, and even some folks walking away from theater forever. This isn't unique to theater, of course. It happens in many workplaces and industries, but that doesn't excuse us from needing to address it as directors. So, let's define facilitation. The very basic definition of facilitate from the Oxford Dictionary is, quote, "to make an action or process easy or easier." Okay, this is a great starting point, but it's broad and not really actionable. But we need to further define how a director in particular can make a theatrical process easier. That starts with looking at what it means for something to be easier. Even when a theatrical process goes well, I don't think anyone would say that making theater is easy. It requires a lot of effort on the part of every person involved to be successful. So if our job isn't to make the work itself easier, maybe it's instead about making working together on the work easier. That feels a little more specific to me. So let's plug it into that earlier definition in our context. One of the jobs of a director is to make the process of working together with others on a piece of theater easy or easier. All right, I think that's getting there. Now let's pause here and acknowledge that, like with everything that directors do, we are not the only ones who are responsible for those things. But we are almost always the most central to the process, and thus our success or failure at different elements of our role have an outsized impact on the process. Working together requires effort from all parties involved, like in any relationship, but as directors, we're like the hub of a wheel. A broken spoke isn't great, but the wheel can still function. If the hub is broken, though, good luck getting anywhere. So when we talk about facilitation being part of a director's role, we're saying that part of our job is to pay attention to how people work together during a process and try to find ways to make it easier for them to work together. Or for some directors, this may come naturally. For others, it may be challenging. Regardless of whether it comes to us naturally or not, though, taking the time to think carefully about what, how, and why we focus on facilitation in our directing role is important, because that's how we build a skill. And skill is what's there when that natural talent, regardless of how much of it we have, fails us. So now that we know what we mean when talking about facilitation in the context of directing, let's explore how we can build our skills as facilitators. You may have noticed that I slipped a new element into that definition a moment ago, namely the idea that the first step in facilitation is paying attention to how people work together. Hopefully this isn't a novel idea. After all, paying attention to the dynamics of how people interact is pretty clearly a big part of directing, though often we think about it in the context of how characters interact with one another rather than how the artists themselves interact with one another. In 2022, the Harvard Business Review surveyed more than 1,000 first-time managers and their teams at 76 different companies worldwide, and found that 91% of conflict between members on a team came down to one of 4 issues: communication differences, opaque performance standards, unreasonable time constraints, and unclear expectations. If you've experienced conflict in a theatrical setting, I'd be willing to bet that you can probably boil it down to one or more of those 4 issues the vast majority of the time. And we'll refer back to these issues as we explore tools available to us as directors to help us build our skill as facilitators. And a bonus benefit to this process is that these are all skills we can use to help us direct characters as well as facilitate between other artists. A note, though, as we transition to this part of the scene, there will be 5 sets of tools and techniques we're discussing, and it may start to feel overwhelming. I encourage you to keep in mind that nobody could possibly learn how to use all of these tools at the same time. So if you choose to watch the whole video, try to listen for the ones that resonate most with you and leave the others for later. And it's okay if you get part of the way through and need to stop watching and come back later. We'll put chapter markers in the video when we upload it and include some time signatures below so that you can jump back to the part that's helpful for you when you come back. Once again, I have a memory tool to help organize these skills, this time with the acronym SCUDS, S-C-U-D-S. Now, the word scud isn't one we hear used often, but as a verb, it's defined by Merriam-Webster as moving or running swiftly, especially as if driven forward. So I thought it worked well for an acronym about how directors can help a project move swiftly and easily forward. It's also used to refer to a type of surface-to-surface guided missile, which is unfortunate, but we're going to call on its original definition here. The 5 components of SCUDS are specificity, curiosity, utility, doing versus talking, and status signals. So let's start with specificity. The Harvard Business Review article that we referenced earlier showed that communication differences accounted for 39% of conflict in the workplaces surveyed, nearly double the next largest contributor, which is probably not surprising, especially in theater. Many of us are drawn to theater because we like communicating ideas through our art, which is full of elements like metaphor, symbolism, subtext, absurdism, and more. In fact, on stage, we tend to eschew super direct communication of ideas because it feels trite or silly. Additionally, many people who are neurodivergent are drawn to the theater, whether we have ADHD, dyslexia, autism, or another form of neurodiversity, all of which impact our manner of communicating. And as we work to make theater more diverse and inclusive, people from all different cultural backgrounds will be asked to communicate with each other. Even just finding a communication channel for a production can be difficult. Some people don't like email because their inbox is overflowing with spam and they'll miss it. Others dislike the use of group texts because they can't mute them easily, while not everyone has Slack or Discord or GroupMe, and some don't want to have to download and manage yet another app. Additionally, in upstream theater environments where there are often folks brand new to theater, many people are inexperienced with getting critical feedback about their work, especially in a public or semi-public space, which can lead to reactionary responses and behavior driven by embarrassment, fear, or anger, which can in turn lead to more embarrassment when they are able to regulate their emotions and realize how their behavior came across to others. So yes, communication is an area that is fraught with opportunities for conflict, but that also means that if we can address the issue head-on, it can have a hugely positive impact on the process. This is also why I sometimes like to think about facilitation as the act of being a translator, because we are helping people understand one another more clearly. Over the last 20 years, I have found that one of the biggest and most important things a director can do in an environment like theater is to be specific. Which is all well and good, but be specific about what? The answer, as frustrating as it may be, is pretty much everything. We need to be specific about goals, plans, methodologies, and most importantly of all, intentions. If you're at all familiar with acting, that word intention probably rings a bell because we talk about character intentions with actors all the time as directors, even if we don't realize that we're doing it. But unlike characters in a play, whose intentions are often intentionally at odds with one another to create conflict and thus drama, we are putting on a play, not being the play ourselves. So it behooves us to minimize a mismatch of intentions as much as possible. Additionally, opaque performance standards and unclear expectations make up 36% of workplace conflict, according to the Harvard Business Review, and specificity can help address those as well. Over the last decade, I've spent a lot of time exploring how to be specific as a facilitator when directing, and it has culminated in a document that I now give to every cast and production team I work with at our first meeting. I call it About the Director, and it includes 4 things that are my top priority in every production I direct or produce, along with 4 common phrases that I use as a director. You can download it from the links below the video, along with a worksheet to help guide you in creating your own version. I won't bore you by reading it to you now, but I want to dig into the reasoning behind the choices I made in creating it. First, it's short, just 1 page front and back, which is intentional because it means people are more likely to actually read it. This meant that I had to carefully consider which things were so important to me that I wanted to make sure that everyone I worked with understood not only what they were, but why they mattered. However, I do usually go over it in the first meeting or read through so that even if someone doesn't read it, they still get the benefit of the basic information. Second, it uses I language. It talks about what matters to me, not what I think should matter to the reader. This is important because we can only ever speak for ourselves. As facilitators, we have to fight the urge to speak for others or put words in their mouths. We need to create an environment where people feel empowered to use their own voice, and by being specific about our intentions, needs, and expectations, we lead by example. And third, it is actionable. The 4th bullet point on the first page is about respect, which is one of those words that most people assume others know the meaning of. So instead of assuming that folks know what I mean, I give a number of examples that are specific to the environment in which we are working. In addition to that document, I've also included a sample Who Does What document, along with a worksheet to help you develop your own, that I've been trialing lately that outlines the things that I ask from my various production team members when I'm working as a director. This outlines my understanding of our roles and is a starting point for discussions and negotiations about how we will work together. I ask them to look it over and let me know if anything doesn't align with their own understanding of how our roles interact so that we can negotiate. For instance, as a director who is also a lighting designer, I get very particular about lighting, so I like to let my lighting designer know that I'd like to be more involved in the design process. When it comes to costume design, I rely a lot more on my costume designers to be self-sufficient because it's not an area I feel as strongly about. Now, if there's a mismatch in our expectations, like say a lighting designer who doesn't like the director being involved in the design process as much, this way we know this up front and can either negotiate our needs or part ways amicably before anyone has invested time or resources into the project. Of course, it's not enough for a director to just be specific in our language. Our behavior has to back it up. A common issue when we work to deconstruct power dynamics and understand them is that we change our language first, because it's easier to change how we talk about something than it is to change how we do it. So, to be an effective facilitator, we have to make sure that when we change our language, that we're able to back it up with our behavior. And we can and will still make mistakes, but people can tell when we're actually trying versus when we're just giving lip service. Now, there are a number of other ways we can learn to be specific as directors that we'll address all throughout deconstructing directing. But we often have to guide those around us to be more specific as well. And one of the best ways to do that is through facilitation skill number 2, curiosity. The Oxford Dictionary defines curiosity as, quote, a strong desire to know or learn something. But surprise, this likely isn't specific enough. I'm going to encourage you to pause the video and take a few moments to consider the following questions. What kinds of things do you think directors could be curious about when it comes to how people work together on a production? How do you think directors can express that curiosity? And do you think curiosity is a skill one can develop? I'll wait here. Welcome back. Whether you pause the video or not, hopefully you had a moment to consider at least one of those questions, because the act of asking those questions means that you're already putting your skill of curiosity to work. I often refer to curiosity as the art of asking effective open-ended questions. An open-ended question usually begins with what, why, how, when, or who, and can be answered with more than yes or no. The reason that I call curiosity a skill is that while many people may naturally be curious about what makes another person who they are, for many of us, it's something that we have to learn to ask. Often when someone does something that we don't like, we use assumptions to jump to conclusions that may or may not be accurate, instead of staying curious. Now, staying curious doesn't mean that our feelings won't be hurt, or that we won't or shouldn't get upset or angry if someone does something that hurts us or others. It also doesn't mean that we should ignore abusive or predatory behavior in the name of, quote, staying curious about the reasons someone does those things. There are absolutely lines that should never be crossed, and it's important to be specific about what those lines are in any conduct agreement for a production, which we'll discuss in a later act. But the vast majority of the time, when conflict, whether minor or major, comes into play, it's important for us as facilitators to try and understand why each person is acting the way that they are. This is essentially identical to the work we do as directors in helping actors understand their characters' motivations, or supporting a designer in exploring an area where they feel stuck. Do note that whether working with characters or artists, true curiosity requires that we save room for the possibility that we are wrong about our assumptions, and that we learn a truth we had not considered before. Check out the curiosity worksheet linked below for a guided reflection on your own curiosity. More about this in later acts. The middle of our SCUDS tools for facilitation is utility. And now in this case, I'm using utility to mean the quality of being enjoyable or useful, which some of you might recall is the definition used in economics. If you've ever read the book Freakonomics by Stephen J. Dubner and Stephen Levitt, there's also a podcast that Dubner hosts, then you know that economics isn't just the study of money. It's a study about why we make the decisions we do. Utility is therefore a measure of whether a good or service is valuable to us, not just monetarily, but in terms of the pleasure or usefulness that we gain from it. We'll jump straight into a theatrical example here. Think about the stereotypical portrayal of an acting class. Maybe you imagine an exercise where actors are instructed to become an animal, or perhaps one where they are supposed to walk around the room at different speeds. Perhaps you see them rolling around on the floor moaning, alternating between ecstasy and deep sorrow. Maybe you've been in an acting class like that. I most certainly have. One of the reasons that many people make fun of these situations or feel lost or silly when doing them is because they don't perceive usefulness or enjoyment from that activity. The activity has no utility for them. If you're anything like me, you probably have dozens of examples of feeling like a meeting, lesson, or activity was pointless, but having to do it anyway. Think about how frustrating that was and how much less you trusted your boss, teacher, or facilitator after that experience. This is why utility is a facilitation skill. It's related to specificity, but it's such an important way of being specific that I've broken it out on its own. In the world of education, schools and colleges understand this, which is why all lessons are supposed to have objectives so that the utility is clear to the learner. But the reality is that it's not enough to just tell them what they're going to learn or do. We also need to make a case for why we believe that it will be useful, if not enjoyable, to them or the project as a whole. I put together a utility worksheet for you to help you think through how you can be specific about the utility of things we commonly do as directors. But let's talk about 2 examples quickly. First, production meetings. What is the utility of those meetings? Now, you may assume that this is a silly thing to say out loud or put in writing because, of course, everyone understands the value of production meetings, but I can tell you from experience that that assumption is often completely wrong. What if you had a new designer who'd been teaching high school theater for 10 years? So for 10 years, they've been a one-person design, direction, and production team. Production meetings happen inside their head in the shower. Now all of a sudden they're expected to show up to a weekly meeting and update other people on their design work and how it's going, on top of all of the other stuff they have going on. Can you see why they might not see the utility in that, especially if they're burnt out and overwhelmed like most teachers are these days? A situation like that is rife for conflict and misunderstood expectations because there wasn't a specific conversation about why production meetings can be valuable, not just for the director, but for the designer as well. Second, actor warm-ups. Why do we do them? So many rehearsals start with warm-ups, but how often do we actually discuss why we are warming up? How often are we specific about the anticipated utility of a particular exercise? I mean, if you do that already, awesome. My experience is that it isn't done nearly enough. And so for those who don't immediately make the connection to why it could be useful or enjoyable for them, they've already checked out before rehearsal has even begun. And just like our first 2 skills, building the skill of identifying and communicating utility has applications for working within a play as well, especially when it comes to character tactics. So, at this point in the scene, you're probably starting to feel like this is an awful lot of talking that has to be done. How will we ever get anything done? Which is a perfect segue to the D of our SCUDS skills, doing versus talking. Just like we would never get anything done with a play if we don't stop table work at some point and get on our feet, it's absolutely possible to spend too much time in the talking and not enough time in the doing. As a facilitator, directors are responsible for helping to strike that balance, which can feel a little daunting, especially perhaps if you're someone who doesn't read social cues easily. How do you know when an individual or a group is ready to move on? The good news is that we already have our answer in our second tool, curiosity. I try to stay very curious about how a process is affecting each person involved, which for me means looking at their body language, breath, amount of contribution to the conversation or process, and more. If I start to see one or more folks checking out, then I'll often pose a question like, hey, I know we've been talking for a bit. Do we need a break? To the group rather than to that person individually so that they don't feel singled out. Now, if you have a hard time reading body language or breath, you can be specific and honest about that. It might sound something like, before we dive into talking about all of this, I'm not always the best at recognizing when folks have had enough talking and need a break. So please don't hesitate to let me know if you reach that point. If you do, I can pretty much guarantee that someone else has too. But more often, it's not about the director droning on, and it's more about a team being unable to really make a decision about how to move forward with a scene or production process. Maybe it's an actor who strongly disagrees with the director about the way a scene should be approached, or a designer who's unwilling to budge on their vision even though it clashes with, say, another designer's vision. The easy choice, and the one we often take in Western society, is either A, to lean on the hierarchy, which might look like the director saying, well, I'm the director, so I'm sorry, Louis, but we're going to go with Chang's proposal. Or B, putting it to a vote, which often leaves those who are outvoted feeling resentful or devalued. This is where consensus-based decision-making can become a powerful tool for driving action. Consensus-based decision-making is an alternative to hierarchical/majority rule decision-making that is rooted in non-Western and non-colonial ideals. I've included a link to a great summary by the Consensus Council Incorporated down below. If you take nothing else away from it, the elements of a consensus-based decision on page 1 and 2 are key. I'll recite them now. All parties agree with the proposed decision and are willing to carry it out. No one will block or obstruct the decision or its implementation, and everyone will support the decision and implement it. The levels of consensus that immediately follow that section are also important. I can say an unqualified yes. I can accept the decision. I can live with the decision. I do not fully agree with the decision, however, I will not block it and will support it. The goal is to ask the group to find a way in which they can all agree to move forward, even if some folks aren't thrilled about it. It requires that people be specific about what elements of the competing ideas are the must-haves in their mind. Sometimes we're adamant about an idea, and then when we are asked to examine exactly why it's important to us, we realize that the same needs can be met in another way. Now, if you spent any time around theater, folks, you may be skeptical about a process like this because we all know that there are often big personalities that will dominate conversations, perhaps refuse to support any decision that isn't theirs, or needle and cajole others into consenting even if they don't really want to. Which brings us to the final skill in SCUDS, status signals. Again, these are all skills we use artistically as directors, and you may have heard about status as it applies to characters on stage. Status in this case refers to social rank, and just like on stage, we navigate status in our daily lives. Right now, you are giving me higher status because you're taking the time to watch this video and consider what I have to say. I'm trying to balance that by anticipating questions or concerns you might have and tailoring this video to address those, giving you higher status than other people in the same situation might. Status is always relative to a situation and the people within it. If an actor and a director are in the room, the director almost always has more power and thus higher status. But add the artistic director into that room, and now the director may feel like they have lower status relative to the artistic director. Notably, comedy usually consists of some sort of status inversion, where someone with typically lower status gets the best of someone with typically higher status. Learning to recognize status signals off the stage is a valuable tool as a facilitator. Body language can be a big part of this, but so can language. Code switching is a survival tool some folks who are marginalized use to protect themselves. A gay man might adopt a more masculine voice when around primarily straight folks, or a black woman might avoid elements of African American vernacular English in mixed company, both so as not to be treated as lower status. And we all code switch to some extent. Just listen to how you sound when you're talking on the phone with your boss versus how you sound when you're talking on the phone with your best friend. Another way to think about watching for status signals is to pay attention to how people treat each other. And if we either A, have a hard time doing that, or B, can't tell if someone is being bothered by how they are being treated, it's often okay to ask them kindly and gently in private. It might sound something like, "Hey, Devin, I noticed that Sue keeps misgendering you and I can't tell if it upsets you or not. Would you like me to speak with her about that?" Now, it's important that I ask Devin instead of just talking to Sue, because Devin may not care that much, or if they do, may not want me to fight their battles for them. Now, in the case of the large personalities that dominate the conversation, we might pull them aside and ask them to use their status to pull others up with them. "Hey, Matt, I need your help with something. You've got so much energy and charisma. It's clear that people look up to you. David is new to the theater, and I've noticed that he tries to join the conversation but keeps getting ignored. Could you keep a lookout for when he tries to join in and help make sure his voice is heard?" I'm not asking for you to speak for him or drag him into things he doesn't want to be in, but just be on the lookout if he does. As with all of our SCUDS skills, by learning to pay attention to status signals in real life, we will become more effective directors artistically, because we will understand status dynamics and negotiations much more easily. this was a bit of a long one. I just want to close with a reminder that nobody could work on all 5 of these skills simultaneously. I encourage you to find the 1 or 2 that resonate most with you as you set some goals for yourself for the next production you work on. And we have a SCUDS worksheet down below to give you a place to write those goals. Remember that there are worksheets for the individual skills as well, along with the transcript and podcast versions of this scene. If you're not a Patreon member and want to be, you can earn fun perks like stickers, monthly hangouts, and Q&A sessions with me, and more for helping support this project financially. But none of this content will ever live behind a paywall, so if you can't or don't want to join the Patreon, don't worry, you'll still get all of Deconstructing Directing completely free. I'll see you again when you're ready to dive into Act 1, Scene 3, Leadership. Until then, I hope that reviewing these SCUDS skills will help propel you forward. Flame on, my fellow directors.